Old School RuneScape is an MMO with plenty of skills to progress. When taking a look at the possible training methods, the appeal of tick manipulation is clear, with many techniques nearly doubling the experience gained per hour. These methods can be intimidating, however, as phrases like tick perfect, which is awfully reminiscent of frame perfect, are thrown around. The thing is, tick manipulation is actually quite forgiving. Even the most precise of methods don't require anything close to frame level precision. It also doesn't need to be used all of the time. These methods are just another tool in your belt, or when you want to pay a bit more attention to the game and get rewarded for it. As with any tool, the best way to make it feel less like black magic is to study it, and that's just what we'll try to do here. Instead of attempting to cover specific training methods, or somehow cover all of them, my intent is to provide you with a framework to explore and perhaps even adapt these methods as you come across them. This of course means we'll use actual examples of tick manipulation, but some may not seem all that useful for training. If there is a particular training method that you find interesting or don't quite understand, let me know and perhaps it'll become a dedicated video. For now, we should start with defining what a game tick even is. Simply put, it is a single execution of the game's logic. Each world or server processes one game tick after another, coordinating what action should happen and when. For consistent gameplay, a single tick is meant to always take 0.6 seconds, but can vary a bit depending upon how busy the world is and if it can finish processing all the events in time. A simple way to observe this timing is to move around in game. If you walk around some obvious tiles, you can roughly count a tick for each one. We'll get into more precise methods in a moment, but let's continue conceptualizing a game tick. It's not just your own actions that are handled this way, but everyone else's as well, as a game tick is global to all players on a world. Since the server is processing these events, this allows for a well-defined interaction between everyone logged in and even the non-player characters. While there are some actions that can happen multiple times per tick, such as dropping items, often we measure how many ticks it takes for an action, such as the 4 ticks it takes to get a roll for a log while woodcutting. This conveniently brings us to talking about the skilling tick. Among other things, the game needs some way of knowing when a player is meant to get a roll on a resource they are gathering. To do so, for each player the server keeps track of a value in terms of ticks, their skilling tick. This can be thought of as an absolute value, such as the player can receive a resource on tick X, or as a timer, such as the player can receive a resource in Y ticks. When interacting with a resource node, like a fishing spot, rock, or tree, 3 different types of outcomes can result depending on the value of the current tick and the skilling tick. If the 2 values are equal, meaning the skilling timer is 0, you have a chance to get something from that resource. You get a roll on its drop table. If the skilling tick is in the past, meaning the skilling timer is negative, it is reset appropriately for that interaction. Otherwise, nothing of consequence happens. This likely raises the question of what ways exist to more precisely observe these game ticks. While some skilling methods essentially turn into a rhythm game where you get a feel for the timing, we can also use in-client tools to help out, especially for demonstration. RuneLite is a client that is officially allowed, natively supported via the Jagex launcher, and I wouldn't be surprised if you're using it already. The 2 plugins that will be the most helpful to start are the default metronome as well as a visual metronome, which can be installed from the plugin hub. The default metronome is just like the ones often used in music, giving an audio cue at regular intervals. Here we can set the interval and number of ticks, and alternate between a tick and a talk sound. While it may be a bit much at times, we'll have this set to go off every tick during most of the demonstrations. The visual metronome is also probably as you expect, a visual representation of these intervals. There are plenty of options available, but we'll focus on visual metronome with show metronome tick number enabled to easily see where we are in a cycle. As for the tick count, we'll vary this depending on what we're observing. As an example, let's take a look at some generic woodcutting. Every 4 ticks we roll for a log, or said another way, if our character interacts with a tree on game tick 1001, we have a chance to get a log on game tick 1004, and again on game tick 1008. Describing this using relative terms, our character starts interacting with the tree on tick 1, where the skilling timer is set to 3 since it is currently negative. On ticks 2 and 3, the player is still interacting with the tree, but all that really happens is the skilling timer decreases to 2 and then 1. The timer drops to 0 on tick 4, meaning a chance to receive a log. The loop then continues ticks 1 through 4, setting and decreasing the skilling timer as appropriate, rolling for a log every tick 4. The start of this loop might be a bit confusing, as to interact with the tree on tick 1, the input actually needs to be registered the tick before. This is why the game may feel more unresponsive at times, as the delay between clicking and performing an action depends on how early or late you make the input during the previous game tick. While this slightly complicates discussing inputs versus game actions, the good news is you usually don't have to. While discussing just inputs or just actions, the distinction doesn't matter. Discussing inputs is often easier to describe what you need to do, while discussing actions is easier to describe why it results in a certain outcome. Before we get to changing that outcome, let's first observe what doesn't change it. The first crucial aspect, which may have seemed trivial when mentioned earlier, is that the skilling timer is only set when it is already negative. This means that nothing changes in our previous woodcutting example if we were to click the tree every tick, or even spam click faster than that. Next, if the game is only keeping track of a timer, there's nothing stopping us from doing things between resource rolls, as long as they don't rely on that same timer. We can first demonstrate this by dropping logs between resource rolls, which many might be doing already without realizing its significance. This also means you can even walk away from a resource and come back, all without breaking the scaling cycle you are already in. We just need to be sure that we are interacting with the tree on both ticks 1 and 4, so that we can receive a log and reset the skilling timer as quickly as possible. But that's not all. Extending this even further, there's nothing tracking which tree we started the action on, so you can even move to another one and use your skilling timer on it instead. Which brings us to our first manipulation that is more efficient. Just like there is no reason we can't move to a resource node of the same type, we can even move to a node for an entirely different skill. Nothing in the skilling timer records what we were interacting with, so anything that uses the same mechanism is fair game. Since both woodcutting and fishing use the same skilling timer, we can leverage the fact that woodcutting is faster to speed up fishing. If on tick 1 our character interacts with a tree, we can switch to the fishing spot on tick 2 to eventually receive a fish on tick 4. This method, known as tree fishing, allows us to roll in these shrimp every 4 ticks instead of every 6. This is nice and all, but is still a bit inconvenient. It requires having a tree close enough and only gets us down to 4 tick actions. Conveniently enough, there are skilling actions that use items in your inventory that we can leverage just about anywhere. Starting with perhaps the least useful, we have standard fletching with most logs. Fletching arrow shafts can be done at level 1, and with closing the interface as fast as possible by holding space, you can start a 4 tick action. While we can't get rid of the interface from that fletching action, we can avoid it with the rest of the methods by making sure we only have the components for a single recipe, such as a single slash of spark to make a battle staff. This also turns out to be a 4 tick action, and is even easier as you only need to click the bark while having a knife in your inventory. Needing to click 2 items to start a skilling action is often awkward, but it does allow us to explore a variety of 3 tick actions as well. Some of the most common ones are fletching teak crossbow stocks, creating various herb tars, and crafting spiky vambraces, all of which operate in essentially the same way as tree fishing. On tick 1, we start a skilling action that sets the skilling timer to 2 instead of 3. On tick 2, we interact with the fishing spot, and on tick 3, we roll for a fish drop. For completeness, I'll also mention that there is a free-to-play method to start a 3 tick cycle that revolves around using snow from holiday items. It requires a bit more effort to upkeep as the snow disappears, so we won't go into the specifics, but otherwise it also works much the same, as you can set the skilling timer to 2 by interacting with the snow. Even though we've been calling it the skilling timer, this same timer is actually used for other actions as well, as we briefly just saw with the snow example. Continuing the theme of inventory actions, eating food also sets it. There is a notable difference, however, as eating increases the skilling timer regardless of its current value, not just if it's already negative. For most foods, this can create a 3 tick cycle, which we can continue to observe while fishing, making sure we set the skilling timer to a known value first, such as by starting a normal woodcutting action. Once we get the expected roll on tick 4, we can then eat a shrimp to increase our skilling timer to 2, allowing us to get another fish on tick 7. From here, we can repeat ticks 5 through 7 to have a 3 tick cycle as long as we have food left to eat. Taking things a step further, food like karambwans instead increase the skilling timer by 2, but can still only be eaten every 3 ticks, requiring some creative loops. For example, if we again start ticks 1 through 4 with a 4 tick cycle to get a fish, we can then eat a karambwan on tick 5 to increase our skilling timer to 1. This means on tick 6, we can roll a fish, but are left with an issue at tick 7. It'd be great if we could eat another karambwan, but we can't. With our skilling timer negative, if we don't interrupt our fishing, we'll just get the default skilling timer. We could start a different skilling action, or more interestingly, we can opt to momentarily stop fishing. If we do so, then on tick 8, we can both eat a karambwan, increasing our skilling timer to 0, and interact with the fishing spot, which allows us to get another fish. Expanding use of the skilling timer even further, we also use it in combat, albeit with some small but significant differences. Instead of getting a resource roll when the skilling timer hits 0, combat allows us to get an attack roll as long as the skilling timer is 0 or negative. Further, whenever we do get an attack roll, we immediately set the skilling timer to our weapon speed instead of setting it to tick after a roll is given. In an odd way, this gives us a pattern of 2 skilling timer actions we can take advantage of. Once to receive a resource roll when the timer hits 0, and then again to attack the following tick when the timer is negative. As an example, if we go back to woodcutting, we can actually get a 3-tick cycle if we attack with a 2-tick weapon like darts. On tick 1, we attack a cow to set our skilling timer to 2. On tick 2, we interact with a tree. And finally on tick 3, we receive a resource roll for a log. Similar to how attacking can set the skilling timer, so too can being attacked. If flinched while not interacting with anything, auto-retaliate sets our skilling timer to half of our attack speed, rounded down. So with a 2 or 3-tick weapon equipped, such as darts or a shortbow, we're able to set the skilling timer to 1 to roll for a resource the next game tick. As most NPCs have an attack speed of 4, this becomes useful if we have 2 attacking, offset so that 1 attacks on tick 1 and another on tick 3. If we switch our setup to auto-retaliate with 2 cows, we can see this in action. On tick 1, we remove any interaction and get flinched by the first cow, setting our skilling timer to 1. On tick 2, we interact with the tree to roll for a log. Tick 3, we remove any interaction again to be flinched by the second cow, again setting the skilling timer to 1. We complete the cycle on tick 4, where we interact with a tree and roll for another log. Note that unlike the previous example, we aren't ever interacting with a cow while the timer is non-positive, so we never actually attack. That said, it is easier to prevent mistakes by using a shortbow without any ammo, or even an uncharged blowpipe. Both still provide a 2-tick cycle when flinched. One thing that can throw off the timing as explained so far is when activities introduce stalls, or delays in our character's actions. The most obvious stalls that you've likely come across are those from various agility obstacles. Perhaps less noticeable is that mining rocks and woodcutting player-grown trees are both stalled after movement. Consider an example where we are mining while stationary with an adamant pickaxe. There should be nothing unexpected about getting a resource roll every 4 ticks. If we add a 1-tile walk, it would then be logical that we also need 1 more tick to receive a resource. However, it ends up taking 2 more ticks. On tick 1, we walk 1 tile. On tick 2, we interact with the rock, which starts a stall, meaning it isn't until tick 3 that our skilling timer starts. Finally, on tick 6, we're able to roll for a resource. With this, it's clear that stalls typically decrease experience rates, but surprisingly we can also use them to our benefit with some careful planning. If we time it so that the stall ends on the same tick where we get a roll, we can actually introduce a double roll. This can either take the form of an actual second resource, as we get here from the Pure Essence, or just a second chance to get a resource, like from Granite. Either way, it's another great boost to experience that can also be paired with 3-tick inventory actions for even more gain. In fact, none of these methods have to be mutually exclusive from each other. Some of the best skilling methods just introduce unique combinations to optimize experience rates. Though I'll caution that experience rates aren't the only metric you should optimize for. It's important to be mindful of what you find comfortable and what you find fun. That may be AFKing while watching YouTube, full focusing on a particular manipulation method, or a mixture of the two when you feel like it. Whatever it is for you, best of luck with your skilling goals, and take care.